Elvis and Priscilla had been married since May of 1967. They had a daughter, Lisa Marie, born February 1st, 1968, almost exactly 1 year before these recording sessions. The marriage was, by most accounts from people who were inside it, already showing the structural damage of what their relationship had been built on. An 8-year courtship that had started when Priscilla was 14 and Elvis was 24. A dynamic of control and idealization that Priscilla had been trying quietly to push against for years. Elvis was away constantly, touring, performing in Las Vegas, on a schedule that had almost nothing to do with domestic life at Graceland. Priscilla, who had moved to Memphis as a teenager and structured her entire existence around Elvis's world, was beginning the private process of reclaiming her own. The divorce would come in February of 1972, finalized in October of 1973. But the conditions for it were already forming in January of 1969 when Elvis recorded a song about being caught in a trap you cannot walk out of. Mark James had written the song about a real love triangle in his own life, married to one woman, still feeling something for a childhood sweetheart who was also married, his wife suspicious, all three of them trapped in something none of them could fully resolve. The song came from a real emotional situation, written by a man who understood what it felt like to love someone and not be able to trust the situation or be trusted inside it. Elvis understood it differently, but no less personally. The man who stood in that studio in the early morning hours of January 23, 1969, and sang those lyrics, the man who kept asking to hear it again, who learned it on the spot, who recorded it last out of 20 songs across 10 days as though he had been saving it, was not performing an abstract emotion, he was inside it. Moman recalled he wanted to hear the song over and over again and learned it on the spot. That detail, over and over again, is not how Elvis behaved with material he was simply recording because it was commercially suitable. That is how a person behaves when something lands somewhere specific. The comeback that Suspicious Minds anchored did what it was supposed to do. Elvis launched his first tour in 9 years in 1970. The Las Vegas residency, which had already begun in July of 1969 at the International Hotel, became one of the most successful venue residencies in entertainment history. He performed sold-out shows for years. The audience that had wondered whether the man in the leather suit from the NBC special was real found out the answer. Yes, he was real, and he was performing live again, and when he sang Suspicious Minds in Las Vegas, the response was immediate and enormous. Mark James, the songwriter who had watched his own version of the song fail completely and then heard Elvis walk past a door and say he wanted it, James described what it meant to watch that happen from the inside. He said that whenever Elvis saw him in the years after, wherever they were, Elvis would cross the room to say hello. He described one specific moment. Elvis was at a table in Las Vegas talking with Sammy Davis Jr. and Andy Williams. James walked into the room, Elvis stood up, walked clear across the room, and said, "Hi Mark, how you been doing?" James's response, recounted in an interview years later, "Man, this guy is something else." The song they had made together between 4 and 7 in the morning in a Memphis studio, the song that a copyright dispute had nearly destroyed, the song with a false fade-out that radio program directors wanted to cut off themselves, that song became the record that completed Elvis Presley's return from a decade of Hollywood movies to the music that had made him everything he was. He never had another #1 after it, but he had that one, and it was enough. The original 1969 recording is on every streaming platform. Go find it and listen to what Elvis does with his voice in the bridge section, where the time signature shifts and the arrangement pulls in 2 different directions at once. Listen to what it sounds like when a man sings about being caught in a trap he cannot walk out of and means every word of it. If this kind of story is what brings you here, subscribe and more of them will find you. See you in the next one.
It took 8 takes to produce the full recording. Elvis also overdubbed himself on the same night, layering his own voice. The arrangement that Chip's Moment built around the song was sophisticated: electric guitar, bass, organ, strings, trumpets, trombones, drums, a full sound that took what James had written and gave it the scale it needed. The song's structure itself was unusual. The time signature shifts in the bridge section, moving from standard 4/4 time to a slower 6/8, then back to the faster 4/4 rhythm, creating a feeling of being pulled in two directions at once that matched exactly what the lyrics were describing. Mark James was in Memphis that night, but not in the studio. He had walked in during a session a few days earlier and sensed that Elvis was uncomfortable with him there. He did not want to jinx the song, he later said. He stayed away. He did not want to be there looking at Elvis while Elvis tried to outdo his performance. When he heard the final take the following day, his first reaction was concern. It sounded slower than his version. But after the overdubs, after the full arrangement came together, James said he was blown away. He told interviewers in later years that as they went along, they made it greater. They made an even greater record out of it. And then, simply, bottom line, it was meant for Elvis. And then, Colonel Tom Parker nearly killed it. Parker had been managing Elvis since 1955, and by 1969 was taking a commission that had grown well above the standard industry rate. His standard business practice when Elvis recorded a song was to demand a portion of the publishing rights. He and Elvis's publishing company, Hill and Range, would approach the songwriter and demand a cut of the royalties in exchange for the recording. Most songwriters agreed because having Elvis record your song was worth more commercially than refusing and losing the opportunity entirely. The system had worked for Parker for years. Chip's Moment was not most songwriters. He was a producer who had built his own publishing operation, who understood exactly what his songs were worth, and who had no intention of handing over any portion of what was his. When Parker's people made their standard demand, Moment accused them of stealing. The Wall Street Journal later quoted Moment on the confrontation. He threatened to halt the entire recording session and send Elvis home rather than give up his rights. The sessions, all 20 songs, everything that would become From Elvis in Memphis and the singles that followed, were on the table. Harry Jenkins, the RCA vice president who was present, stepped in. Jenkins understood what was at stake. He told Parker's people to stand down because he could hear that the song was going to be a major hit and there would be plenty to go around. Parker's demands were dropped. The recording of Suspicious Minds was allowed to stand, but the conflict left a residue. Moment told the Wall Street Journal that Felton Jarvis, Elvis's regular producer, had never been happy with Elvis recording at American Sound at all. It was a control thing, Moment said, and that unhappiness expressed itself in the one alteration to the song that nearly damaged it commercially. Jarvis added a false fade-out. At the 3-minute 36-second mark in Suspicious Minds, the song appears to end. The volume drops, fades to near silence, holds for 15 seconds, and then comes back. The first verse continues afterward before the song fades completely. Moment called it a scar in the song. He hated it, and he was not wrong to hate it. When the single was released, radio program directors across the country were confused and irritated by it. Bill Gavin, whose trade publication, The Gavin Report, was read by every program director in America, said he could not count how many of them told him they would not play the song unless they could cut it off themselves, and that it almost killed the record.
American Sound Studio sat about 10 miles north of Graceland. Moment had founded it in 1964 after years at Stax Records, and by 1969 he had placed 125 records on the Billboard charts over 5 years. Artists including Wilson Pickett, Dusty Springfield, Aretha Franklin, and the Box Tops had all recorded there. The in-house band, known as the Memphis Boys, was considered one of the finest rhythm sections anywhere in the country. Moman understood Memphis music the way that very few producers did. Not just the sound, but the specific intersection of blues, gospel, country, and soul that had produced everything remarkable that had ever come out of that city. Elvis had not recorded in Memphis since 1955, 14 years. The last time he had been in a Memphis studio, he had been a 20-year-old truck driver recording at Sun. Now he was 34 years old, returning to his home city after a decade and a half of Hollywood, with a career that needed more than a television special to save it. According to Mark James, Elvis was hesitant about the sessions. James described it plainly. It was like backing up. Elvis had built his career in Memphis and then left it behind for Los Angeles and Nashville and the big studio machines. Coming back felt, to James's eye, like Elvis was uneasy, wondering whether he should be there, whether returning was an acknowledgement of something he did not want to acknowledge. It was Marty Laker, one of Elvis's closest friends and part of his inner circle, who had pushed hardest for the Memphis sessions. Laker had worked with Moman before and believed that what the studio and what Elvis could do together was something that could not be replicated in Hollywood or Nashville. He had brought it up repeatedly with Elvis over months before the sessions were finally scheduled. When the booking was confirmed, Moman rescheduled Neil Diamond, who had already been booked at American Sound, to make room. Diamond agreed on one condition, that Elvis record one of his songs. Elvis recorded "And the Grass Won't Pay No Mind" during those sessions as a result. The January sessions ran from January 13th through January 23rd, 1969. Elvis cut 20 songs in those 10 days. The Memphis boys knew their instruments so well and their chemistry was so tight that arrangements came together in the room organically in ways that the Nashville session system rarely allowed. Chips Moman was a different kind of producer from the ones Elvis had been working with. Direct, confident in his own musical judgment, unimpressed by celebrity in a way that kept the sessions honest. Felton Jarvis, Elvis's regular RCA producer, was present too, but Moman was running the room, and there was a tension between the two men throughout the sessions that would eventually surface in a very specific and damaging way. "Suspicious Minds" was the last song recorded in the January sessions. It was cut in the early morning hours of January 23, 1969, between 4 and 7 in the morning. By that point, Elvis and the Memphis boys had been recording together for 10 days and had found a working rhythm. The music machinists already knew the arrangement for Suspicious Minds. They had recorded it with Mark James the year before, when James had made his original version in the same studio. When Elvis snapped his fingers and said, "Yeah, Suspicious Minds, we forgot that one. Let's cut that thing right now," the band did not need a long rehearsal. They clicked into it. George Klein, one of Elvis's oldest friends who was present at the session that night, described the atmosphere in the room as a magical moment when everything had gone right. Biographer Peter Guralnick and music historian Ernst Jorgensen, in their respective accounts of the Memphis sessions, both described the positive energy in the studio as Elvis recorded the song. Something was working, something was clicking in a way that had not clicked in a very long time.
In January of 1969, a songwriter named Mark James was sitting in his office at American Sound Studio in Memphis, Tennessee, playing a record he had made the year before. The record had done nothing. It had been released on Scepter Records in 1968, promoted with genuine effort, and gone absolutely nowhere on the charts. The song was called Suspicious Minds, and as far as most people in the music industry were concerned, it was finished, a failed single by a songwriter who had not yet broken through, sitting in a small office in a recording studio, playing it to himself. Then Elvis Presley walked past the door. What happened next is documented in the account of Donna Jean Godchaux, who had sung backing vocals on James's original recording and was present that day at American Sound. She described it this way: Elvis was in the studio, Mark James had an office there, and Mark was playing the demo, the one with the background vocals, when Elvis walked by the door. Elvis walked in. He looked at James and said 4 words: "I want that song. And I want those girls." Those 4 words were the beginning of the last #1 single of Elvis Presley's career. The song that had failed for Mark James became, in November of 1969, the record that ended 7.5 years of chart drought for Elvis and announced to the entire American music industry that the king had returned. This is the story of how it happened, what stood in the way, what Elvis heard in those lyrics that made him need the song, and why Suspicious Minds became one of the most important recordings of his life. To understand why January of 1969 mattered so much, you have to understand what the 7 years before it had looked like for Elvis Presley. In April of 1962, Good Luck Charm reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was Elvis's 13th chart topper, and it was followed over the next 7 years by a period of commercial and artistic decline that the people closest to him watched with growing alarm. He had been making movies, 31 of them between 1960 and 1969, and recording the soundtracks to go with them. The films were formulaic, the music was lighter than anything he had recorded in the 1950s, and the audience that had screamed for him in 1956 and 1957 had been replaced culturally by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan and a generation of artists who had grown up studying Elvis and then built something new on top of what he had created. Elvis knew it. He told people privately that he was embarrassed by the pictures. He had told director Steve Binder before taping the NBC special in 1968 that he felt his career had stalled completely. And RCA had released 32 Presley singles between Good Luck Charm in 1962 and Suspicious Minds in 1969. 32 singles, none of them #1. Several of them not even reaching the top 10. For a man who had defined American popular music for a decade, that was a long and painful drought. The 1968 NBC special cracked something open. The broadcast, aired on December 3, 1968, became the highest-rated program on NBC for the entire year and reminded an audience that had grown accustomed to the Hollywood version of Elvis that the original version was still inside there somewhere. The man who could stand on a stage in a black leather suit and command a room the way he had at Sun Records in 1954, that man was still present, still capable of what he had always been capable of. The special did not solve everything, but it created a window, and Chips Moman's studio in Memphis was how Elvis walked through it.